In the Forbidden City, there are almost 10,000 gates, or doors. Today, some of them are opened in the morning to the thousands of visitors who visit this special place. But in the past, only princes and high-ranking officials could step through them. In 1861, on the first day of the 11th month of the lunar year, this was the scene at court. From that time, China was ruled by someone from behind the curtain. Almost in the middle of the Forbidden City, but slightly to the west, is the Hall of Mental Cultivation, one of the most mysterious palaces. During the time of Emperor Yongzheng in the Qing dynasty, this palace became the political center of China. One day before the rule from behind the curtain began, Man Yu, Prince Sui, received an imperial edict which spared him having to sit through court rituals, the reason being that Man Yu held the highest position in the imperial family hierarchy. He wondered, however, what the difference was between the familiar ancestral system of rule and this ceremony of holding court from behind the curtain. From the time of the Ming Dynasty, all China's emperors had held court in basically the same manner, and this was referred to as attending court at an imperial gate or attending court in the imperial hall. The Forbidden City is divided into two parts by the square in front of the Gate of Heavenly Purity, and these two parts are the outer court and the inner court. The emperors of the Ming Dynasty attended to daily affairs in the outer court, whereas emperors of the Qin Dynasty attended to daily affairs in the inner court. During the Ming Dynasty, officials setting out for the Forbidden City from the south and east of Beijing would first come to Meridian Gate and then cross the golden water bridges to the Gate of Imperial Supremacy, today's Gate of Supreme Harmony. The emperor took a route from the Palace of Heavenly Purity, the Hall of Imperial Supremacy, or the Gates of Imperial Supremacy, a distance of about 500 meters. During the Qin Dynasty, officials entered the Forbidden City through the East China Gate, and then passed the Gate of Lucky Scenery before reaching the Gate of Heavenly Purity. For the emperor, this meant walking a distance of just 50 meters from the Hall of Heavenly Purity to the Gate of Heavenly Purity. It was in the Qin Dynasty that the emperor's office was moved from the outer court to the inner court, and this was an alteration that implied a change in the political system in the 500 years of the Ming and Qing dynasties up to that point. According to the compilation of state regulations in the Ming Dynasty, when the emperor held morning court, ministers had to rise at midnight and then make their way through half of the capital to get to Meridian Gate. And all ministers had to be waiting outside Meridian Gate before 3 a.m. When the drum in the tower of Meridian Gate was struck, the ministers had to line up. And when the bell tolled, The gate was opened. The officials entered the palace in turns, and then made their way across the gold water bridges to the square, where they took their places according to their ranks. Court supervisors would take notes as to who coughed, spat, or even walked unsteadily, and those who committed such misdemeanors would be punished. When the emperor arrived at the gate of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, it was usual for any official to kneel with his head touching the ground 3 times. Only civil officials ranked at 4th grade or above ever had the opportunity to talk to the emperor. These ministers would present the emperor with reports on state affairs, and the emperor would ask questions, which the officials would answer. One day in late autumn of 1498, a fire broke out in the palace, and Emperor Hongzhi had no sleep that entire night. Interestingly, he asked for leave from attending court the next day, as it was customary for the emperor to ask his ministers to grant him leave if he could not hold court for some reason. But by a decade later, Emperor Zhengde was not bothering to inform officials if he was not attending court, and sometimes the ministers would wait for the whole day until being finally told at dusk that there would be no court meeting that day. After this, the understandably hungry and thirsty ministers would make a dash for home, causing chaos at Meridian Gate. And on one such occasion, an army general was crushed to death. It was in fact not unusual for emperors to neglect state affairs. During the reign of Emperor Wan Li in the late Ming Dynasty, ministers did not see the emperor at court at all for more than 20 years. For those emperors in the Ming Dynasty who did not hold a court at all, relied instead on certain of their ministers to deal with state affairs, according to a predetermined set of procedures, and so the state machine was able to continue operating guided by the emperor or not. The situation in the Qing Dynasty was markedly different, however. In the Qin Dynasty, a minister's task was to simply take orders and run errands, with the emperor essentially taking care of everything himself. Most emperors in the Qin Dynasty were diligent in attending to state affairs. Stores selling artworks near Qianqing Gate Square were called Jiao Qingfang, or houses for 9 degrees of officials, and these were places where ministers in the Qing Dynasty waited for an audience at court. On the first day of the 11th month of the lunar year in 1861, Mian Yu and the ministers waited at this place to meet the new ruler behind the curtain. Throughout history, on every occasion when imperial power was threatened in some way, inevitably some unusual measures had to be adopted. Ruling from behind the curtain was just such a case of using special measures to control imperial power. In the 500 years from the beginning of the Ming Dynasty to the end of the Qin Dynasty, the Forbidden City was gradually built up into an imperial palace that was quite unrivaled. But during the same period, feudal China's centralized state power experienced its rise and then its fall before finally coming to an end. In feudal China before the Ming Dynasty, the term for prime minister was zaisha, and as the head of both civil officials and military offices, he was so powerful that an imperial edict could actually be invalid if it lacked his signature. But with such power concentrated in the hands of this civil official, conflicts over power inevitably occurred between him and the emperor. After Zhu Yuanzhang founded the Ming Dynasty, however, he abolished the position of zaisha and established a new political power system. In 1402, Emperor Yongle of the Ming Dynasty, who had just seized the throne from his nephew, made two decisions aimed at consolidating his power. Firstly, he moved the capital to Beijing, a location that had been his sphere of influence in the past. And secondly, he set up the Neikur, the Grand Secretariat, an institution for consultation on state affairs. In the past, the Prime Minister had held the real decision-making power, the power to discuss state affairs, and the administrative power. But from the time of the establishment of the Grand Secretariat by Emperor Yongle, the decision-making power was tightly controlled by the Emperor, and the power to discuss state affairs was given to the Grand Secretariat, with the administrative power divided among the 6 ministries. In the case of local governments, 3 departments were established to be in charge of the judiciary, the military, and administration, and they were directly responsible to the 6 ministries. Under the control of the Ming Emperor Yongle, the Grand Secretariat and the 6 ministries functioned well. The highest administrative orders were issued from the Forbidden City, and then relayed to 1,936 posts, which were linked together by post roads that extended some 143,700 kilometers. In this way, every order was passed down to every corner of the empire. During the reign of Emperor Xuanzong of the Ming Dynasty, an even more complete system was established. All memos to the throne, long or short, even suggestions made by common people, were collected by the transmission office and submitted to the emperor by the directorate of the ceremonial. After the emperor read them, they were handed over to the Grand Secretariat, which was responsible for drafting remarks. After this, the directorate of the ceremonial handed the remarks to the emperor for approval. Finally, these were reviewed by the 6 sections of the Office for the Scrutiny of Metropolitan Officials, before finally being passed down. The remarks of the Grand Secretariat, called piaoni, were written on a piece of paper which was pasted on the cover of the memos. The emperor would write his instructions or comments in red ink, and so this was called pei hong. According to regulations, however, the emperor wrote his instructions or comments on only a few memos, as most of the emperor's comments were in fact written by eunuchs or the directorate of the ceremonial on behalf of the emperor. In the past, the education of eunuchs had been strictly forbidden, but Emperor Xuanzong of the Ming Dynasty not only changed this regulation, but even set up a special school for eunuchs in the imperial palace. People in later generations speculated that Emperor Xuanzong's intention had been to use eunuchs to curtail the power of the Grand Secretariat. Whatever the case, as time passed, a rather strange political system came into being. In the Ming Dynasty, the organizational structure of the inner court and that of the outer court were completely symmetrical with each other. There was the Grand Secretariat in the outer court, and there was the Directorate of Ceremonial in the inner court. There were governors and imperial grand coordinators who could be dispatched by the outer court, and there were stationed eunuchs who could be dispatched to the locals by the inner court. In this way, the inner court and the outer court were operated under a system of mutual check, and this ensured that decision-making remained the prerogative of the emperor. However, this system also resulted in contending for power and profit between these two political forces, of the outer and inner courts. In the Ming Dynasty, the building in the eastern part of the Forbidden City was called the Tower of Profound Learning, and it was the office of the Grand Secretariat. During the reign of Emperor Wanli, the Grand Secretary of the Grand Secretariat, Zhang turned this otherwise common building in the Forbidden City into a place that exerted a powerful influence. The Grand Secretariat, with its office, became the de facto decision-maker on state affairs. On the surface, the routine flow of state affairs remained unchanged, but the decision-making power had been transferred. But how was Zhang able to make this come about? First of all, Emperor Wanli was only a small boy at the time, and Zhang was the emperor's mentor, and thus he was in a position that enabled him to influence the emperor's decisions. Secondly, the comments of Emperor Wanli were written under the instructions of Feng Bao of the Directorate of Ceremonials, and he had a close relationship with Zhang. Quite simply, Zhang instructed others to write a memo on this matter according to his opinion, and then he approved it on behalf of the emperor. In this way, the memos of the ministers, the comment drafts of the Grand Secretariat, and the imperial comments of the emperor were all effectively controlled by Zhang, something quite unprecedented in China's history. Any political schemes he came up with were carried out without impediment. Since the Directorate of Ceremonials controlled the power of writing imperial comments, eunuchs had the chance to be involved in the management of state affairs. As a result, a power struggle between the eunuchs and the Grand Secretariat developed and became increasingly fierce, finally reaching an explosive peak in the year 1506. One day in late autumn of 1506, the eunuchs of the Directorate of Ceremonial were to be seen rushing between the Palace of Heavenly Purity and of the Grand Secretariat. But why? Because eunuch Liu Jin had become very powerful, and the Grand Secretariat had decided to accuse him of certain wrongdoings. Emperor Zhang, however, had not made his attitude on the matter known. The officials of the Grand Secretariat decided to stage a showdown in court the next day. If they could not be rid of Liu Jin, then all the members of the Grand Secretariat would resign. On the next day, court was held in the square at the Gate of Supreme Harmony as usual, but Emperor Zhang did not show up. Liu Jin came instead. Liu Jin, who had been in charge of horses, had been appointed the steward of the Directorate of Ceremonials. The emperor had turned hostile to the Grand Secretariat. In reality, the backstage supporter of the eunuchs had been none other than the emperor himself. To accuse a eunuch who had won the favor of the emperor was to threaten imperial power, and to the emperor, this was intolerable. From that day on, all important official documents from all over the country had to be submitted to Liu Jin first, and only after Liu Jin had read them could they be passed on to the 6 ministries and to the Grand Secretariat. But how had Liu Jin been able to obtain the power to write imperial comments with the emperor in the first place? The answer was simple. Emperor Zhang spent his days riding horses and sporting with his eagles, and he had even set up a market in the inner court where he dressed himself up as a merchant for fun. The clever Liu Jin would only ask the emperor for his opinions regarding state affairs when the emperor was in the mood for play, and each time the emperor would show his impatience with the words, "Don't bother me with this kind of thing." In this way, Liu Jin was able to write imperial comments on court memos on behalf of the emperor. We do not know whether the officials in the Ming Dynasty trembled with fear when they passed through Meridian Gate, but it is known that after Liu Jin came to power, 23 officials were flogged. Flogging of a court official with a big stick was divided into flogging with heart and flogging severely. An individual who was flogged with heart could end up seriously handicapped if luck went against him, but those who were flogged severely had no chance of remaining alive. And the supervisor of punishment decided whether an official was flogged lightly or severely on the way the man to be flogged stood on his toes. Clearly, eunuchs played an important role in the politics of the Ming Dynasty, but it was during the reign of Emperor Tianqi that their power reached its zenith. At this time, the number of eunuchs in the palace totaled some 100,000. Emperor Tianqi found that he could not sleep well, and it was due to one of his eunuchs. Wei Zhongxian, the chief eunuch, lived not far from the emperor's dwelling and kept very early hours. The problem was that when he washed his face, he made a great deal of noise with his bronze basin, without paying any attention to the feelings of the emperor. But such was the power of this eunuch that people had to wish Wei Zhongxian a long life of 1,000 years, then later 9,000 years, and finally 9,999 years. And in ancient China, a life of 10,000 years could only be wished for the emperor. Since the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, the center of power had alternated between these places, and the transfer of power into different hands had a great influence on the fates of the Ming Dynasty. Inside the walls of the palace, conspiracies over power and power struggles were frequent. After the efforts of several emperors, a complete administration system of state affairs had been formed. It can be said that this system was perfect in the terms of balance of power and was similar to later Western systems. The system of the Grand Secretariat and its chief, that appeared in the reign of Emperor Changhua in the Ming Dynasty, was really a prototype of the Western system of a cabinet and prime minister. However, in the last years of the Ming Dynasty, this system was changed, and without the support it needed from such a well-designed system, the dynasty ended up like a poorly reinforced building, and its fall could not easily be prevented. In the second year of the reign of Emperor Chongzhen, Wang Taiqi led 100,000 Manchu cavalrymen, circumvented Shanghai Guan Pass guarded by Yuan Chunhuan, assaulted Sunhua, and launched a surprise attack on Beijing. Yuan Chunhuan responded by leading his troops back to defend Beijing. However, Emperor Chongzhen suspected that he would attack the capital together with the Manchus. When Yuan Chunhuan died an unnatural death, the Ming troops began surrendering to the Manchus. The troops in eastern Liaoning said, "The general was so loyal, but he could not be spared from death. For what then should we fight on?" According to historical records, on the day before Li Chucheng took Beijing, Emperor Chongzhen struck the bell in the Palace of Heavenly Purity to summon his officials, but no one came. After 200 years, the rule of the Ming Dynasty had come to its end, and the last emperor of the Ming Dynasty went to the top of Jingshan Hill, took a final look at the brilliant Forbidden City, and then, amidst combat cries of the peasant army that had risen in revolt, committed suicide by hanging himself. The Ming Dynasty had been overthrown by Li Zicheng. and just a month later, the Manchus formally took Beijing. But although the Forbidden City now had a new master, imperial power, like the Imperial Palace, continued as before in what was to be China's last feudal dynasty. One day in the first month of winter in 1722, Emperor Yongzheng issued an imperial edict. All comments or instructions that had been written by Emperor Kangxi were to be handed in to the imperial court, and any who refused to hand them over would be punished severely. Emperor Yongzheng had only just ascended the throne, so why was he so anxious to reclaim comments and instructions that had been written by Emperor Kangxi, his predecessor? Later speculation held that Emperor Kangxi had expressed his opinion about his successor to the imperial throne, and that among these comments and instructions were some that would be detrimental to the reign of Emperor Yongzheng. Starting from that moment, Emperor Yongzheng worked on concentrating his power. 3 years later, when a French missionary talked about his first impressions of Emperor Yongzheng, he said, "He was big and tall and good at talking, but he spoke too fast. It seemed that he was wise and in high spirits." Emperor Yongzheng moved his place of sleep from the Palace of Heavenly Purity to the Hall of Mental Cultivation. He was deeply concerned about his power. He had not long ascended the throne, and his reign was not yet sufficiently stable. But this was exactly the kind of vexation that had been experienced by a number of his predecessors. In the early Qin dynasty, Nuar Ha-Chur had set up the Deliberative Council, which consisted of grand ministers, and through this, all state affairs were discussed and decided by the council. Incredibly, the council even had the power to dismiss the emperor. But this stipulation, arranged by Nuar Ha-Chur, brought big troubles upon successors to the throne. Because of it, Emperor Shenzhi was troubled by a powerful prince named Duar Arghun, and Emperor Kangxi was troubled by Aobai's dominating influence. In both cases, these were persons who made the emperor feel uneasy, even when eating and sleeping, and they were leading individual in the deliberative council. The west warm chamber of the Hall of Mental Cultivation was the place where Emperor Yongzheng attended to state affairs and read memos. A couplet written by Yongzheng himself hangs here, and it expresses his longing for the control of power. In order to strengthen imperial power, Emperor Shenzhi restored the Grand Secretariat of the Ming Dynasty, and Emperor Kangxi established the Southern Study, both moves that were intended to diminish the power of the Deliberative Council. However, these moves were not once and for all approaches. Emperor Yongzheng was keenly aware of the fact that the Deliberative Council was still a strong threat to his throne. But in the 8th year of his reign, Emperor Yongzheng found his opportunity. A war between the Qing dynasty and the Mongol Gur-Aden was underway, and the Grand Secretariat was responsible for sorting out matters of military intelligence. The emperor contended that certain secrets may have been divulged, and with this, he established the Privy Council of Military Affairs. The houses along the northwestern side of the square, in front of the Gate of Heavenly Purity, were the working place of the Privy Council of Military Affairs. It is said there was originally a 2-meter wide space between the houses of the Privy Council of Military Affairs and the palace wall, a passageway that led to the Hall of Mental Cultivation via the Imperial Kitchen. Although no such passageway can now be found, on the palace wall near the imperial kitchen, there do seem to be traces indicating that such a passageway once existed. When the emperor summoned him, no matter which way he took, the Grand Minister of the Privy Council of Military Affairs had to walk only 50 meters from his office to the Hall of Mental Cultivation. The emperor would read the memo submitted by his officials, and the Grand Minister would listen carefully to the emperor's oral instructions, return to his office to write down the imperial instructions, return to the Hall of Mental Cultivation, and ask the emperor to make a final decision on the draft. And the whole process took only 2 hours. After the drafts of imperial instructions had been approved by the emperor, they became official imperial edicts, which were then issued by the office of the Grand Council of State. The office of the Grand Council of State would set the speed for the delivery of the documents according to their degree of urgency. If a document was marked for immediate delivery, it would be passed on at a speed of 150 kilometers a day. If a document was even more urgent, it could be passed on at a speed of 200, 250, or even 300 kilometers a day. In these cases, the postmaster would change his horses at posts along the way and ride the horse as fast as possible to deliver the documents to local officials. In this way, the emperor issued orders directly to officials at various levels through the office of the Grand Council of State. As a result, the office of Grand Council of State gradually became the new pivot of state power, and over time, this caused the deliberative council, as set up by new Archer, to exist in name only. Functioning as the administrative pivot, the Grand Secretariat in the Ming Dynasty was 1,000 meters from the emperor's sleeping palace. By comparison, the office of the Grand Council of State in the Qing Dynasty, which also functioned as the administrative pivot, was only 50 meters from the emperor's sleeping palace. Clearly, the emperor was taking tighter control of power. After the establishment of the office of the Grand Council of State, Emperor Yungjung finally realized his ideal of only one man rules the country. However, under this arrangement, the heavy burden of this concentrated power had to be shouldered by the emperor alone, and those emperors who are not shrewd or capable enough to deal with it found themselves in difficulty. The 4th day of July in the year 1840 witnessed the sudden appearance of British warships in the sea near Dinghai in Zhejiang province. When the Dinghai County magistrate boarded one of the warships and asked what they had come for, the British ordered him to surrender within a day, and that if he didn't, they would open fire on the town. Life in the Forbidden City in Beijing was going on the same as always. The next day, as usual, Emperor Daguan paid respects to the Empress Dowager in the morning before reading several routine official documents. But by this time, Dinghai County in Zhejiang, which was several thousand kilometers from Beijing, had been captured by the British. Any memo sent from Dinghai to Beijing using the fastest speed would still take 20 days, so Emperor Daguan did not learn of the fall of Dinghai until July 24th. During those 20 days, local officials were unable to receive orders from the emperor and did not know how to cope with the situation. As a result, they missed the opportunity to fight back. Emperor Daguan received reports of war from different places in succession, and together they depicted a confusing picture. It was not until August 9th that Emperor Daguan finally learned that Britain had started a war. By this time, more than a month had passed since the beginning of the war, and by now British warships were approaching Tianjin. Under the centralized imperial system of control, the decision-maker on all affairs relating to war was the emperor. But Emperor Daoguan had not only failed to learn of the war situation in time, but he also knew nothing at all about Britain. Right up to the end of the war, Emperor Daoguan was still asking questions such as, "I hear the English Channel is 70,000 leagues from China, but where is it?" In history, this war is referred to as the First Opium War. In the exhibition hall in the office of the Grand Council of State, a number of small memo boxes can be seen on display. In the process of establishing and improving the system of secret memo submissions initiated by Emperor Yongzheng, this kind of memo box became widely used. During the Ming Dynasty, memos to the throne written by ministers were submitted to the emperor via local governments at all levels, but in some cases, certain court officials had known the contents of the memo before the emperor had even read them. In order to ensure secrecy, Emperor Yongzheng used these boxes to retain memos securely. A special bronze lock made in a court was used to lock the box, and only the emperor and the official who wrote the memo had the key to the lock. In this way, no one would know the contents of the memos written by officials except one person, the emperor. It is written that the emperor stated, "My ears and eyes can hear and see what is going on all over the country." Emperor Yongzheng, by means of this system of secret memo submissions, extended his influence in every direction. Even officials working in the same place had to be on guard against each other, harboring suspicions of others. This kind of secret system did give the emperor easy access to information on conditions and feelings at lower levels, but it also provided a lot of opportunities for certain people to speak or act on hearsay evidence. At the time of establishing the secret memo submission system, Emperor Yongzheng reiterated that being extremely cautious and dealing with secret memos is the most important thing of all. If the emperor fails to keep the contents of a memo secret, he will betray the trust of his officials. If an official fails to keep the contents of a memo secret, he will die for it. Can't we take this seriously? During the Second Opium War, after the Anglo-French Allied forces fought their way into the city of Guangzhou, they captured a number of memo boxes in the governor's office, and among them were some secret memos to Emperor Daoguan written by Qi Yin, the governor of Guangdong and Guangxi provinces. In these secret memos were a number of insulting remarks leveled against foreigners, and so some Britons began to harbor resentment. Qi Yin, insulted to his face by these Britons when they were at the negotiating table, left before the negotiation had ended. Later, as a result of this misconduct in office, he was ordered to commit suicide. Emperor Yongzheng, who established the system of secret memos, would never have imagined that 100 years later, such top-secret memos could be captured by foreign invaders as easily as if they were waste paper. Emperor Daoguan compared managing state affairs and ruling a country to the maintenance of a big house. He said, "If the dweller makes patches and repairs whenever it is necessary, the house will remain in good shape. But if the dweller lets damage take its course, in the end, considerable restoration work has to be done." The Forbidden City was just such a big house, whose construction had been begun by Emperor Yongle of the Ming Dynasty. The political system of the feudal dynasties had been patched and repaired a number of times, but in the end, these emperors and imperial power itself became history. It was the first day of the 11th lunar month of 1861, and the rule of China by someone sitting behind the curtain had just begun. The arrangement in the court had been changed. There were now 2 thrones in the court, one in front of the other, and there was a curtain between them. Prince Mianyu and ministers paid respect to the young emperor on the throne in the front, but the decrees they heard came from behind the curtain. After Sushi took over all power, the emperor on the front throne was nothing more than a puppet. Empress Dowager Sushi played the role of a powerful emperor in her own unique way, and this time the centralization of state power in the Qin dynasty reached another pinnacle. On the 12th day of the second lunar month in 1912, the last political activity related to feudal rule in China was held in a hall of mental cultivation. But what happened could hardly be called holding court, because the only item in this ceremony was the issuing of the Edict of Abdication by Empress Dowager Longyu and 6-year-old Pu Yi. Attending to court affairs at the imperial gate and attending court affairs from behind the curtain had become a system of the past, and China's feudal dynasties became forever relegated to history.